macro photography and some of the issues and kind of advantages of how photography works, that you can almost jury-rig some of macro photography as opposed to having to buy fancy toys to get it done. First, let's start with some basic concepts. As we focus, we've talked about this in some of the previous videos, as we focus towards infinity, we actually bring the lens back towards our sensor. So as we focus towards infinity, we bring the lens back towards the sensor until it hits the infinity point. You can actually focus past infinity by going too close to the sensor, and that just puts everything out of focus. As you focus to closer objects, right, as your objects that you're focusing on come in, you actually bring this out. You can see that this is now longer here. This is longer here than it is when I focus down to infinity. So the further we can get this out, the closer we can focus in. What macro is just focusing very, very close. That's what the word is used for now. The true definition of macro is that you're making an image, like the image you make on your camera is exactly the same size as the sensor in your camera. This is the size of the image we're making right now, right? We're at about 15 inches across for our image space. Well, the sensor in the camera that's shooting this is 36 by 24. So it's this guy right here. So you can see that we're not currently shooting macro because we're not shooting a one-to-one, this sensor in the camera photographing this much space. For a camera that has an APS-C sensor that's a little bit smaller, that's this guy right here, you can see that that's this second one right here. So if I use this camera to take a macro photograph, I'm going to be taking a photograph of an object that is no bigger than about 24 by 16. If I'm using something like an iPhone, a true macro is down at about 6 by 4 millimeters, so very, very small. So true macro is one-to-one or smaller, right? So if I took a picture of this square on this camera, that's still macro. Anything better than one-to-one or one-to-one is macro. Now, to effectively do macro on cameras, we have a few options. As you can see with what the system I'm using right now, this is not macro. It's still relatively close. I would say that the distance from lens to my hand is maybe about 2 feet, right? This is my desk. And this is not as close focus as this lens does. The lens that I'm using right now is just a pretty standard 55mm portrait lens. Let's see how close we can go. So that is close focused on my hand. And that, I would say, is about 15 inches right there. And I would say that my image frame is about 7 inches across at this point. So we're not getting anywhere near actual macro. And you can, I don't know if you can hear that tap as I hit the bottom of the focus. Tap. But that is the bottom of the focus for this camera. Let me get focus back on the tabletop. Let's see. Yep, that looks pretty good. So when we focus in, we're bringing this out. When we focus towards infinity, towards the horizon, we're bringing this in. The reason all these lenses spin to do this is just that our hands aren't really good at doing this very finely. So by putting it on a screw, we can move a lot this way for only a tiny bit of movement in and out, and a screw just helps us, helps our muscles focus. We can have screws that are longer, so we can have lenses where the screw element makes a bigger gap and then comes back in. This is just another standard lens. We can also have lenses that are macro. This is an older macro lens. This is a f2.8 60mm Mamiya Secor. This is one I actually couldn't find an adapter for, so I had to kind of rig one. We can see that it would mount here. I can actually mount it. So right now we are at minimum. You probably can't see it on the image, but there's a little infinity symbol. It means we're at infinity on this lens. Now, to focus in, this is a macro, so we are going to be able to get close. It's not a true macro. It does not go down to one-to-one, I don't think. Oh no, this actually does do one-to-one. I'm sorry. So, as we move this, look at how far all of this is moving. Look at how big this just got. Let's go back to infinity. So this is this long, and we can see that the lens element is actually pretty far down in there. So I would say the lens element's about here, and the lens element is going to travel with this front ring. It's not going to travel with the back of the body. It's going to travel with this front component. So as we spin this out to macro, see how much bigger, because not only are we adding all this distance here, but we're adding all this distance here as well. So we've gone from a lens where our element is here to our element being about here. That's a significant improvement in magnification. That's a significant drop in how close we can be to our object. Again, that's in equivalency with a lens like this. Right here, we're only going from here to maybe there. I would say that's about 4 millimeters of movement. Here on this, we are at, let's see, say something around 60 millimeters of movement to get that out, to get it out towards macro. And now let's see what this looks like. I'm going to swap this lens really quick, and we can see what this macro actually looks like. So now, this is at infinity. Of course, we're not going to see anything because the desk is in the way of infinity. That is focused down to the desk. So I would say that is probably 6 or 7 millimeters closer than infinity on the lens, on the little screw on the lens. Of course, this is not 6 or 7 millimeters closer than infinity. But this is the focal range, just like we had. This was the lens we were using before. It just doesn't focus down as far. So we can see that to go to full on this, that's only maybe a 8 millimeter drop for that. Alright, now let's see where we can get close focused. We can use our, sample here, right? Obviously not macro. We're not doing a 1-to-1. Let's see if we can actually get down to a macro. See if we get, went the wrong way. Okay. See if we can get closer. Alright, I'm just going to go all the way out and we'll see where we can get. So that is fully in, right? That's focused as tight as it can go. Oh, sorry guys, I can't quite hold this as smoothly. But we can see that we are just about filling the frame with another one of this frame. So that 1-to-1 description on this lens is very accurate. We can get a 1-to-1 version of the object that we are photographing. Let's have another example that might be something that you guys have. So here is a Sharpie. Let me move so I can get a little stiffer hold on this. Here, let's turn that right side up. So here is a Sharpie. So you can actually see the fail in the prints on something like this. This Sharpie marker, here's my thumb, just for example. But Sharpie, how close we are. One thing that macro lenses do as well is they oftentimes can maintain a little bit of distance between the front lens element and their 1-to-1 object. So from that front piece of metal here, we are about 3 inches away from this Sharpie. Right? And you want that because you don't, if you're taking a picture of a little bug or something like that, you don't want to have to put the bug up against the front lens element. You do want a little bit of distance. This is oftentimes why macro lenses are not 20 millimeters. They're more often 60 to 100 millimeters, and that will make more sense. We're going to leave this lens on here just to avoid. There we go. Let's get focus back out. Alright, this is the same thing. We're just not using this as a macro lens because we're not seeing this 1-to-1. Now there are other kinds of macro lenses. This is an older, actually this one's newer than the one that's on the camera right now, but this one's a little weird in that the focus is still a screw, right? As I screw this back and forth, you can see that bit coming in and out. But this says it's macro. It says macro right there. Oh, says macro right there. But this does not go to macro. I can actually look at the biggest size reproduction that this will do is 1 to 2.55. Right, which is, so if we look at, through this lens, if we look at this piece of paper, the best magnification we will get is 2.5 of our sensor size. We won't be able to get down to 1:1. So just realize that some things that say macro are not actually true 1:1 macros. This lens is a little weird. This is an 80 to 200. This is something you won't see, but the zoom on this, so to zoom in and out, is not a separate screw. Oftentimes we have two screws. We have a screw for focus, or sorry, we have a screw for zoom generally in the back, and then a screw for focus in front of that, and then aperture is either in front of or behind. But this is actually push-pull mechanism. So I actually just pull this and it moves some of the internal elements to allow us to zoom in from 200 to 80. So we're at 80 up here, we're at 200 here, and you can see that this differentiation here will give us where our macro actually is. Where does this value actually hit on this lens? So yeah, so you can have these weird push-pull lenses on some older things, but most of the time you're going to have two screws with another screw for aperture, right? The aperture for this lens is way back here. Now, you'll see there's actually another piece here that's different, right? There's a different brand object. This is a micro, or sorry, it's not micro. This is M42 screw. So this lens is from an old film camera that uses an M42 screw. The M42 screw is the size of this just thread here. This is an adapter. What this adapter does is I screw this on. Well, let's get it threaded correctly. Thread that on. And then what this adapter does is it pushes the lens out and away from our sensor. So, there's a little bit of dust on the sensor. I'll have to clean that out. But here we have our sensor, and the distance from that sensor to this flange on Sony E-mount, I think, is 19 millimeters or something like that. It's very short. I think it's 18 or 19 millimeters. Now, the flange distance for these old film cameras that had M42 mounts, they were much longer. They were like 45, 50 millimeters. So what we do is we have this adapter chunk that just all this piece of metal here does is it pushes out our lens enough so when we focus to infinity, we're actually getting it at the right point. If this thing is too short, that means that our infinity focus point will be wrong. If it's too long, we actually won't ever be able to focus to infinity at all. So this can be an issue that if you're adapting some lenses to some camera bodies, you will end up with a macro-only lens. And by macro-only, I don't mean like you only get 1:1 or better. I mean you're not going to be able to make it to infinity. So there are some instances where the lens you're mounting on the camera body does not have enough of a gap to give you a mount adapter, and then it'll make it so the lens will work fine at shorter distances, but it does not work all the way to infinity. So that could be a trouble for people who use the full flange distance Nikon and Canon bodies. Those are very long flanges. Those are as long or longer than these. So it's very hard to adapt old lenses to them. The mirrorless stuff, pretty much no matter the brand, is going to be a very thin focal distance, or flange focal distance. And that allows you to put these big chunky adapters in here, and it lets you mount pretty much whatever you want. So an M42 mount is relatively big, and as you can see, that adapter is relatively deep. This is an M39 mount, which is a Leica version. Let's see if I can pop that off. There we go. So same style screw mount right here, except it's just a little bit thinner, but you can see how much smaller this adapter is. So this was made for just a different kind of camera, and it uses a different mount than this. And then to get it to focus correctly, we put it on the correct depth adapters. And then you can actually, if you look, there's little screws out here, and you can see that that threaded portion was a different color. Let me get that back out. This threaded portion's a different color. And so you can actually pop these screws out, and you can pull out this threaded component, and you can shim the back of this to get your infinity focus to be exactly right if you want. It's not usually worthwhile. Usually it's easier to just do it on the preview on your camera. But for people who really want to be able to just slam the infinity focus around and hit infinity, that's something that you can do with these adapters. I don't bother. I think I did on this one, but I don't know if I did on any of the rest of them. We can see also that this lens element comes way back. It almost comes back to the back end of the adapter. That doesn't really matter, but just realize that this is called an exit pupil. So if you ever hear me say exit pupil, it's how far back this last lens element is in the system. That has very weird connotations for sensor design, but nothing that we need to deal with here. Now, we can actually use this thing, right? Again, if we have this correct, we focus correctly. Infinity is infinity. If it's too long, we can never focus to infinity. If it's too short, all of our stuff will just be wonky, and a huge amount of our focal range on the lens will be past infinity and thus useless. So we don't want this too short, and we don't want this too long. However, what if I have a lens that's for this camera? Let's say this lens is built for this camera, but I want to take a picture of something closer than what this lens can focus down to. So this might work for some of your kit lenses and things like that that come with your camera, and you can focus to, you know, maybe 1.5 feet or 2 feet, something like that on those, but you want to focus closer. Well, there's an option for you, and it's a relatively inexpensive option. These, let me get this out of the way. These are macro extension tubes. These are kind of the cheap half measure, but honestly, they do a great job for their money. You can get them in different sizes. This is a 10 millimeter, so this will push the lens out another 10 millimeters. This is 16, so this will push the lens out 16 millimeters. And usually you get these in sets of 2 or 3 that are all different lengths. And then one really nice thing is that if you want a lot of macro, you can just clip these together and make a 26 millimeter extension tube, and then you can take this off. We can add this, let's see if I can get this lined up. We can add this here, we can add this here, and now we have another we're another 26 millimeters closer back here, so we can probably get much closer to 1:1, if not actually hit 1:1 on this arrangement. So we have these are macro extension tubes. One thing you'll notice with these have light blocking. So the tops and bottoms are actually gated to help keep extra light from bouncing around inside the lens. That's okay. It doesn't really matter as much as you might think, especially for something like macro where you're going to be pretty heavily editing the image afterwards anyway. Another thing that's interesting, you can see here, these little sensors. These are just the contacts that match these contacts here, and you can see that there's a matching pair back here. So what these contacts do is they just pass through the data from the lens to your camera. So if we take a modern lens that has sensor contacts, right, that has autofocus and tells your camera what it is and all that stuff, well, these little dots here will pass that data through to our camera body so we can use our camera as an autofocus. Of course, it's going to freak out because everything's going to need to be much closer for it to focus, but this will allow autofocus and aperture control from the camera body and things like that. This lens, for example, has no aperture ring, right? It's just got a focus ring and that's it. So we cannot control the aperture of this lens unless we have it electronically attached to the body. So we need macro extension tubes that have these contacts. You can get macro extension tubes that don't have these contacts, and they're oftentimes quite a bit cheaper. But I would suggest just going ahead and getting the ones with these because they're not that much more expensive, and they do give you the ability to talk to electronic lenses. So these are very simple. They just mount on as if this was another camera body, and then your lens is on there, and then you can release it just the same. Before we move on, I do want to discuss a little bit about the issue with focal plane, well, not focal plane, with depth of field in macro photography. This can be handled a few different ways, right? As we focus closer to our objects, those light lines become, more and more convergent, and they're less and less parallel. So we get a very, very sharp and thin depth of field. We can see here. Let me go the other way. They open this up. So if I focus, sorry, wrong way. So if I focus on my finger here, look at how out of focus this thing is, only a few inches behind it, right? So the light is coming in, crossing, and then going out, and we can see that the distance apart is these little dots back here. With that, we need to be very, very cautious, because as we get closer and closer, let me go all the way in. Let's see. So we can see that, like, the top of the skin on my nail is in focus. You can see that the side of my finger right here is completely out of focus, and that's 5 millimeters away. But if I zoom out, or sorry, if I focus out, we can see that my whole hand is in focus. Right, so the depth of field is much thicker out here than it is in here, because those rays are becoming more and more parallel versus more and more convergent as we get closer. This makes macro photography actually much simpler on a small sensor camera than on a big one, because as you get closer to the same size object, you have that small sensor, you can be a little bit further away, and the convergence isn't as sharp because of that size, because you're not going back out to that big sensor. You're not going big sensor, lens, aperture, and then back out to your object. You're staying much tighter for a small sensor and small object. So this can actually make, sometimes, honestly, just shooting on your phone and cropping in can be a better macro experience, a better small object photography experience than, all this complicated goodies that makes this possible. One thing I will not be covering, I'll cover in concept, but we're not going to talk about it much, is macro focus stacking. And focus stacking is where, to deal with the issue of how tight focus is up here, what you do is you would actually, to get a object like this in focus, what you would do is you would actually go all the way to the closest point. You'd focus into the closest point, take a picture, then go out a little bit, take a picture, 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 and keep doing that. And then you would stack those photographs in your photo editor of choice, and it would make an image with a greater than actual depth of field. That's wonderful. The big issue with that is that it depends on what software you use as to how it works. It also can depend significantly on the camera you're using as to what the range of each photograph you need to take is. Some are very tight, some are relatively larger. I believe there are some that can actually do a video and then pull it back out, but I don't remember which ones do that. But yeah, so that's too specific for this kind of generalist stuff where I don't know exactly what kind of cameras everybody's using. So what I would like to do right now is we're going to go do some practical macro photography, and I just want to show you some examples of what this is. First, we're going to start out with the lens that we're using right now. Again, that is an old, busted 60mm f2.8 that does have a 1-to-1 macro capability. So we are out and about. I'm gonna see what we can do with these flowers. The mic is kind of getting in the way. Here we go. I don't know if you can hear me actually touching these things. So we can see how freakishly tight the depth of field is. It's like literally just the wind pushing the plant back and forth is enough to push it in and out of focus. So I'm going to stop down a little bit. It's going to get dark. Now that is stopped down, I think, to f16. Let me check. Yep, that's stopped down to f16. And we can see that that is much better. It's still relatively short, right? You can't see anything behind this. You can't see the house behind it or anything like that. But we can at least see all of our object in focus. This is one place where image stabilization helps immensely, especially for video. This is probably very shaky cam, and that's not awesome, but it's what we got. And I wanted to show you guys on video. But we can look around and see all these things in this really tiny world. And so this is 1-to-1, which means when we think back to that little drawing that I had, that's how big these objects are, assuming they're in focus. Right? If they're out of focus, they could be any little bug. It's an aphid, I think. What are you? Some sort of strange orange bug. No idea what that is. Looks scary. There's one thing, bugs look real scary at 1-1. Let's go see what else we can find to look at. Here is Velcro and some stitching on a pair of gloves. You can see the text right there. Nice, very small. If you needed to do some craft stuff and wanted it to look like this, you totally could. Here are some of those tiny tomatoes from the last video, the tomato plant. You can see every little detail. Now, of course, you can also do things like microscopy, where you're actually using a microscope to do this in a much more controlled and prepared environment. But there is something nice to just be able to go out and you know, shoot with your camera as is. Let's see what else we can see. One thing I really would suggest if you're going to do this, put a UV filter, just a clear piece of glass on the front of your camera, because you're going to be so close to stuff that you're going to bump into it. And that is just not awesome for lenses. You really don't want to be hitting the end of your lens onto objects, especially little smushy things like, you know, fruits and plants and bugs and stuff. What I want to think about is you also don't have to use a macro lens at full magnification. This, we're at about 0.3-to-1, so there's about 3 times as much image as the size of the sensor. And for some objects, that's correct, right? This flower would be way too big if I zoomed all the way into the center of it, and it just wouldn't look right. So don't think you always have to be at the very nth degree of what your equipment can do. Oftentimes backing out a little bit is entirely the right choice. Now here we have a 300mm lens. This is that big 300, which close focuses generally to about 15 feet. Now I have just put both of those little macro extension tubes on there, totaling 26mm of additional extension behind the lens. That has only gotten me down to about 9 feet. Let me go pace it just to check. So it's probably closer to 8 feet. So those flowers in the middle of the frame are about 8 feet away from the lens. Now this doesn't seem like much, and it doesn't seem like much magnification, but it is. It's almost doubled my available magnification, if not a little bit more. And I could put more macro extension tubes on here if I wanted to. Now, why would I do this instead of that lens I was just using where I could get right up on stuff? Because I am 8 feet away from these flowers, which means that if I'm shooting insects or if I'm photographing birds or whatever, this gives me distance. This allows me to do what most people would think of as macro photography, but from a distance where I'm not going to be bothering wildlife. Of course, 8 feet's enough that like a squirrel will notice you, but if you set the camera and leave it and have it on remote and you can go stand inside, you can get some really interesting pictures on bird feeders or squirrel feeders or whatever little creatures you want to feed and take pictures of. You can totally do that and without bothering them, right? If you get up too close to a butterfly or something like that, you're going to bother it and it is not going to be friends with you. So do realize you can use interesting combinations and just go through and test everything. That's one of the really nice things about these macro extension tubes versus buying some really expensive specific macro stuff, is that you get some of these other options that can be actually more useful day to day than a true macro lens. I'm not saying that true macro lenses aren't awesome. They totally are. But do realize that there are some other available methods, I guess, for photographing this stuff. There's a butterfly flying around, and I'm hoping it stands still so I can photograph it, but I don't think it's going to. Nope, it's not going to. It just flew away. Yeah, realize that these can be very, very useful in all sorts of combinations. One thing to note, again, this is a 300 millimeter lens. I've added both of those macro extension tubes, and it's not really shifted my close focus that much, which seems like that's not great, but realize that's okay in this case, but that's going to do the adverse. It's going to do the opposite thing for short lenses. A short lens, if you put like a 16 to 20 millimeter lens, if you put these macro extension tubes on there, you can actually cause the close focus point to come inside the front element of the lens, and we definitely do not want to do that. So just be aware that if you add the macro extension tubes and all of a sudden you seem like you can't focus on anything, you might have actually drawn the focal point inside of the lens, and that's just no good at all. Oh, there's a bee. Let's see. Oh yeah, you can see him. There he is. Let's see if I can close focus just a little bit on that guy. There he is. It's gonna get shaky cam for a second. There's a few moments of that bee.